Let's go live now to the economics editor at the Australian Adam Creighton. Adam, good to see you.
Morning, Laura.
We've been talking about productivity. Well, we always talk about productivity, but more recently it's come to the fore. You've written today in the Australian about, what Australia needs to do. What's the recommendation?
Yeah, look, we certainly do talk a lot more about productivity, not just in this country, but around the world, because productivity growth has been slowing steadily. And we actually had our worst performance in Australia in the 2018 financial year, what's called multi-factor productivity, which tries to take into account the increase in hours worked and also the increase in machines, and basically divide those two things by output. That grew at its slowest pace yet by 0.5%. And so politicians and officials worry a great deal about this. Look, what I'm saying is we shouldn't really stress too much about these aggregate figures, because they really are extremely hard to compute, because there are just so many moving parts to the economy. My central solution is just to go from first principles to reduce as many kind of unnecessary regulations as possible. Just last week we saw a quite interesting report from the Institute of Public Affairs in Melbourne, which basically found out that the number of regulations in laws has increased about 50-fold since 1975, and so certainly that should explain to some extent the slowdown in productivity growth, whatever the figures might say.
But how do you increase productivity? I mean, if people aren't getting paid more money, or if there isn't more wage growth, how do you increase, an incentive to be more productive?
Now, look, it's a very good question, but my point is the government really can't do too much about that of itself. Yeah. Of course, everyone has an incentive in their own life, whether it's a business or an individual, to improve their own productivity. So the incentives are all there in the first place. It's just a matter of kind of removing the barriers and regulations that make it harder for them to do that. I think the other interesting thing about productivity is that all of the goods and services in our lives that don't have any price, so for instance when we use Google Maps or when we use various other apps on the internet that save time, those things are not actually being picked up in the productivity statistics because they don't have a price. And so it may well be that our productivity has improved quite a lot. I mean, certainly, just to take Google Maps, for instance, I mean, surely that has saved us all a great deal of time.
Yes.
But that doesn't show up at all in the statistics.
Yeah, that's true. And maybe our statistics, as you say, are a bit out of date. I want to ask you about Donald Trump. He's playing down fears of a recession in the United States. And as Pete was saying as well, looking at the economic data out of the EU, it is looking pretty good. There was a bit of an outlier which caused these recession fears in the United States. But what is that overall picture and how's it looking to you?
Yeah, look, just firstly on the US, obviously the President is concerned about the likelihood of a recession. The US is currently in the longest period of expansion since the Second World War. It's finally beaten the previous record only last month. So, of course, some people are naturally thinking that it's more and more likely that a recession will occur because we just haven't had one for so long. But I think we still need to look at the facts, and the facts are that the US jobless rate is the lowest since 1969. Jobs growth there is extremely strong. The stock market, OK, sure, it fell a few percentage points last week, but the reality is it's still up double-digit percentages in recent years. It's essentially at record highs. So there really is no reason to be calling on the Fed to cut its interest rates again. I mean, I find it extraordinary, actually, that there's all this talk of slashing rates when the fundamentals of the economy are still strong. Surely we should wait until there is actually a problem, because if we cut early, then we won't have any ammunition when there is actually a problem.
Yeah, Adam, we had Jennifer Westacott on our show last Friday, and she didn't really seem that concerned about the problems of the US potentially slipping into recession next November. I think she doubts that will actually happen. But how significant would it be if a country like Germany, which is the most powerful in Europe, if that slipped into recession, what would the flow-on effects? Could the flow-on effects be?
Well, look, certainly Europe has always had sluggish growth. I mean, its population growth is extremely slow, and that partly explains why it grows so slowly. Germany, of course, is extremely susceptible to the growth rate of China, and we've seen a slowdown in China, and so German exports of cars and other machinery have slowed significantly. I mean, I think the German economy remains in quite good health domestically. It's just that, as I said, its export sector is so vulnerable to even slight downturns in the Chinese economy. Again, though, you can make similar points about Europe. Interest rates there are even lower than in the US, and so I think further calls for the European Central Bank to engage in even further quantitative easing, I think, only spook markets and scare markets. I think governments need to take a step back and just let their economies function.
Just quickly on the Royal Commission, we see Josh Frydenberg announcing fast-tracking of the 76 recommendations. I would say it's 75 as well, because they've ignored one of them in there about mortgage brokers, and also the definition of fast-tracking, introducing legislation by the end of 2020. Now, I take the point that, you know, it does take time to do these things and they should be done carefully. How significant or how realistic is that timeline?
Well, look, I think the timeline is very realistic because as we just suggested, it's quite far off. But just in terms of the overall package, you know, the government, of course, is out there saying it's the biggest reforms in 30 years. I mean, I think that's almost farcical. I mean, the reality is many of the recommendations, as we've been through earlier this year, don't really have much teeth. And so, you know, we saw the stock prices surge enormously on the day the recommendations came out, of the banks, that is. And so the only people suffering really are the small guys out of these recommendations, some of the brokers, some of the financial planners. And look, I'm not saying that those recommendations are bad ones. It's just that the big end of town has basically completely escaped censure.